No one in that house dared look Bianca Vitali in the eye. Not the guards, not the housekeeper, not the last 4 nurses who had quit before their second week was up. For 3 months, she hadn't spoken a single word to anyone under that roof. Then, a 22-year-old nurse from a bad zip code wheeled her out onto the terrace, knelt down in front of her wheelchair, and Bianca Vitali opened her mouth and said one word that made every man in that house go completely still. Ren Delaney had exactly $61 in her checking account and a rusted-out Corolla that stalled at every red light on Fenner Avenue. She was 22 years old, 6 months out of nursing school, and entirely unqualified, on paper, for the job posting that had shown up in her inbox at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. Private live-in care, elderly female patient, post-stroke, wheelchair-bound. Compensation is triple the market rate. Discretion required. No agency affiliation. She should have deleted it. Every instinct honed by 3 semesters of clinical rotations told her that no agency affiliation and discretion required were code for something she didn't want any part of. But her landlord had taped a 5-day notice to her door that morning, yellow paper flapping in the wind like a flag of surrender, and her mother's old sedan needed a transmission she couldn't afford, and the hospital where she'd done her rotations wasn't hiring new grads until spring. She read the email 3 times. She hit reply before she could talk herself out of it. The interview happened 2 days later in a downtown office that didn't have a name on the door, just a buzzer and a man in a gray suit who asked her exactly 4 questions and then told her a car would come for her Thursday morning. She didn't ask who she'd be working for. She had learned, working weekend shifts at a diner through most of nursing school, that some questions cost you the job before you'd even started it. Ren had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, raised by a single mother who worked double shifts at a call center and came home smelling like burnt coffee and other people's frustration. There hadn't been money for much growing up. New clothes came from the clearance rack. Dinner some weeks was whatever was on sale and could stretch across 5 nights. But there had always been enough love in that cramped apartment to make up for it, right up until her mother's heart gave out on a Tuesday morning 2 years ago, quietly, in her sleep, the way some people are lucky enough to go. Ren had finished nursing school on loans and grit and the stubborn, aching certainty that her mother would have wanted her to finish what she started. She had worked weekend shifts at a diner on Fenner Avenue through most of her clinical rotations, learning to read exhausted, difficult people in scrubs long before she ever learned to read them in a hospital gown, learning that most anger, most silence, most refusal to be helped came from somewhere underneath itself that had nothing to do with the person standing in front of it. It was a lesson that had cost her plenty of bad tips and one particularly memorable plate of eggs thrown at her apron. It was also, she would come to understand, the exact education that made her useful in a house full of people who had learned, for very different reasons, not to trust anyone easily. The car that came for her Thursday morning was a black sedan with tinted windows and a driver who didn't say a word the entire 40-minute ride out of the city. Ren sat in the back in her light blue scrub top, the fabric still stiff with the newness of it, and watched the skyline shrink behind her, replaced by hills, then trees, then a stretch of stone wall that seemed to go on for a full mile before it finally gave way to a set of iron gates. The gates opened without anyone touching them. Somewhere, a camera had already read her face. The estate on the other side looked like something lifted whole out of a magazine she'd have flipped past in a waiting room, too far removed from her own life to feel real. Gray stone, dark windows, a fountain in the circular drive that had been shut off for the season. Ren stepped out of the car and stood there for a second too long, taking it in, before a woman in a black cardigan appeared at the top of the front steps and told her, not unkindly, to hurry up. Mr. Vitali didn't like to be kept waiting. Wren had pictured a man in his 60s, silver hair, reading glasses, the kind of soft-spoken menace she associated with the word boss from movies she'd half-watched on other people's couches. What she got instead, standing in the marble foyer with his hands in the pockets of a dark suit that fit him like it had been built around his shoulders, was a man who couldn't have been much past 35. Luca Vitali had a face that belonged on a coin, all clean, hard lines, and eyes so dark they didn't seem to reflect the chandelier light at all. He looked at her the way she imagined a jeweler looked at a stone he hadn't decided the value of yet. "You're the nurse," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice had a low, worn smooth quality to it, like gravel that had been sitting in a riverbed a long time. "Wren Delaney," she said, and put her hand out before she could second-guess it. He looked at her hand for a second longer than was comfortable, then shook it. His grip was warm and controlled, the hand of a man who had learned exactly how much pressure to use so he'd never accidentally hurt anything he touched. "You're younger than the others," he said. "I'm the only one who answered by Wednesday," Wren said. "I figured that counted for something." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. A man who had forgotten how a while ago and was testing whether the muscles still worked. "My mother has had 4 nurses in 3 months, Luca said, turning and starting down the hall, clearly expecting her to follow. The first one lasted 6 days. The second lasted 4. The third and fourth didn't make it past the first afternoon." "What happened to them?" "Nothing happened to them," Luca said. "That's the problem. My mother didn't yell at them. She didn't throw anything. She just looked at them and never said a single word, and by the end of the day they were sitting in my study asking me to call them a cab." He stopped in front of a set of double doors, dark wood, carved with something ornate Wren didn't have time to study. "She hasn't spoken since the stroke. Not one word. Not to me, not to her doctors, not to the physical therapist who comes twice a week and leaves looking like he's aged a decade. The doctors say there's no medical reason for it. Her speech center is intact. She simply will not speak." Wren adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder. "And you think I'll last longer than 6 days?" "I think," Luca said, his dark eyes settling on her face with an intensity that made her want to look away and made her refuse to, both at once, "that you have nothing left to lose, which means you might actually be useful to me instead of afraid of me. That's rarer than you'd think." He pushed open the doors. The room beyond was a sitting room done in pale gold and cream, wide windows looking out over a garden gone quiet with early winter. In the center of it, in a wheelchair positioned exactly in a shaft of window light, sat Bianca Vitali. She was smaller than Wren expected, bird-like in the way some elderly women get, all sharp collarbones and thin wrists, but there was nothing frail about her posture. She sat bolt upright, spine straight as a plumb line, her silver hair pulled back into a knot so severe it looked like it hurt. Her left hand rested motionless in her lap, the fingers slightly curled, the telltale signature of the stroke. Her right hand gripped the armrest of the wheelchair like she was bracing for impact. Her eyes, when they landed on Wren, were the same flat, assessing dark as her son's, and they didn't move away. "Mama," Luca said, crossing the room and crouching slightly beside the wheelchair, his voice dropping into something gentler than anything he'd used with Wren. "This is Wren. She's going to be looking after you." Bianca Vitali looked at Wren for a long, unblinking moment. Then she turned her face toward the window, deliberately, the way a queen dismisses a servant she has already decided isn't worth the air it would take to speak to. Wren felt the rejection land somewhere just under her ribs, sharp and immediate. She had expected difficult. She had not expected to feel, within 4 seconds of meeting the woman, like she'd already failed a test she didn't know the rules to. "She does that," Luca said, straightening up. There was something tired in the set of his shoulders, something that didn't match the cold precision of the man who'd shaken her hand in the foyer. "I'll have Renata show you to your room and go over the schedule. Physical therapy is Tuesdays and Fridays. Medications are in the cabinet in her bathroom, all labeled. If you need anything, there's a house line in your room. Dial 0 and someone will find me." "And if she needs something and won't tell me what it is?" Ren asked, glancing back at the small, rigid figure by the window. Luca's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Then you'll learn to read her the way the rest of us have had to. Good luck, Miss Delaney." He walked out without looking back, and the doors shut behind him with a soft, final click, leaving Ren alone in a gold and cream room with an old woman who had already decided she didn't exist. Renata turned out to be the woman in the black cardigan from the front steps, a stout, no-nonsense housekeeper in her 50s with a faint accent Ren couldn't place and a habit of talking fast, like she wanted to get information out before someone told her to stop. She walked Ren through the east wing, the guest room that would be hers, small but nicer than any place she'd ever lived, with its own bathroom and a window that looked out over the same quiet garden. And then through the medication cabinet, the physical therapy schedule, the emergency numbers taped inside a kitchen drawer. "The last one," Renata said, lowering her voice as they stood outside Bianca's sitting room that evening. "The fourth one. She tried to make Signora Vitale eat her lunch, and the Signora just stared at her. Didn't touch the fork. Didn't touch the food. Sat there for 2 hours until the girl started crying and packed her bags." Renata shook her head. "Nobody in this house has heard that woman's voice in 3 months. Some of the men, the ones who work for Mr. Vitale, they're more scared of her silence than they are of him. At least he yells. She just looks at you." "Why won't she talk?" Ren asked. "Medically, I mean. If her speech center's intact." "You'll have to ask the doctors that," Renata said. "All I know is her husband died 4 years ago, and her other son—" She stopped herself, glanced down the hall like the walls might be listening, and shook her head again. "That's not my story to tell. Just do your job, be patient, and don't take it personal when she looks through you like glass. She does it to everybody, even Mr. Vitale some days." It was nearly a month before Ren learned the rest of it, and even then, only in pieces, the way most true things in that house seemed to arrive. Sideways, half-finished, offered by someone who clearly felt they were breaking a rule just by mentioning it. She was folding linens in the small laundry room off the kitchen one evening when Renata came in to start a load of her own, and the older woman, tired in a way that made her looser with her words than usual, finally filled in the gap she'd left standing open weeks before. "Mr. Vitale had a younger brother," Renata said, not looking up from the sheets she was sorting. "Sandro, good boy, from what I remember. Softer than Luca, always laughing, never wanted any part of the business his father built. He left for the coast when he was 20, said he wanted nothing to do with any of it, and for a long time it seemed like he'd gotten his wish. Then his father passed, 4 years ago, heart attack at his own desk, and 6 months after the funeral, Sandra was killed in what the papers called an accident. A car that went off a coastal road at night, in weather that wasn't bad enough to explain it." Renata's mouth pressed into a thin, unhappy line. "Nobody in this house believes it was an accident. Nobody has ever proven it wasn't either. Signora Vitale buried a husband and a son inside of 6 months, and after the second funeral, she stopped talking. Not right away. It came on slow, over a few weeks, like she was running out of words the way you run out of money, a little at a time, until one day there was nothing left to spend." Ren stood very still, a folded pillowcase forgotten in her hands. Does Luca think it was Costigan? Or whoever's been circling the family? Mr. Vitali doesn't say what he thinks out loud, Renata said. Not to me, not to anyone in this house. But he changed after that, too. Before, he used to laugh like his brother did, I'm told, back before I came to work here. I've never once heard it. She finally looked up, meeting Ren's eyes with an expression that was equal parts warning and plea. Whatever you're starting to feel for that man, and don't tell me you're not. I've got eyes. Just know you're not only looking after his mother in this house. You're looking after the last piece of softness either one of them has left. Don't be careless with it. Ren thought about that conversation for days afterward, turning it over every time she caught Luca watching his mother with that particular, guarded tenderness. Every time Bianca's right hand found hers and held on a beat too long, like she was reassuring herself that this one, too, wasn't going to disappear. It explained things she hadn't had words for before. The way grief in that house wasn't loud. The way it lived instead in silences and locked doors, and a woman who had decided, 4 years ago, that speaking simply cost more than she had left to give. Ren spent that first night lying awake in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the house settle around her, the wind moving through trees she couldn't see, and thinking about the flat, assessing look Bianca Vitali had given her before turning her face to the window. She had cared for difficult patients before, in her clinical rotations. Men who spat at nurses, women who screamed obscenities through the fog of dementia, a teenage boy recovering from a car accident who had thrown a bedpan at her head. She had never once been rattled by anger. Anger she knew how to sit with. Silence, deliberate and total, was something else entirely. The first week went almost exactly the way Renata had described the others going. Ren brought Bianca her meals on schedule, adjusted her blankets, walked her through her range of motion exercises with the same patient, steady patter she'd use on any post-stroke patient, narrating each movement, checking in even though she got no answer, treating the silence like it was simply one side of a conversation that hadn't started yet, rather than a wall she was supposed to be intimidated by. Bianca watched her with those flat, dark eyes and said nothing. She let Ren move her left arm through its exercises without resistance, which the physical therapist, a nervous, overworked man named Dr. Okonkwo, who came twice a week, told her was already more cooperation than he'd gotten in a month. She fights everyone else, Dr. Okonkwo said on Ren's third Friday, watching Bianca allow Ren to guide her curled fingers open and closed, a slow, mechanical rhythm. Not you. I don't know what you're doing differently. I'm not doing anything, Ren admitted. I just don't take it personally when she ignores me. I figure she's got a reason for the silence, even if I don't know what it is. Doesn't mean I have to stop talking to her. What she didn't say, because it sounded stupid even inside her own head, was that some nights, after she'd wheeled Bianca to her bedroom and gotten her settled and dimmed the lights, she caught the old woman watching her with an expression that wasn't hostile at all. It was something closer to curiosity, like she was waiting to see how long it would take this one to crack, the way the other 4 had, and was mildly, privately surprised every day that it hadn't happened yet. Luca Vitale, Ren learned quickly, was rarely in the house before 9 at night. She heard him more than she saw him those first 2 weeks. The low rumble of his voice through the walls of his study, the sound of the front door, the particular weight of his footsteps on the marble that she started, without meaning to, learning to recognize. When their paths did cross, in a hallway or the kitchen where she went to fix Bianca's evening tea, he asked her short, clipped questions. How is she sleeping? Has she eaten? Did Okonkwo say anything about her grip strength? He never asked how Ren herself was doing, and she told herself she didn't expect him to. He was paying her triple the going rate to look after his mother, not to be her friend. It was the third week when the routine cracked open a little, on an afternoon that started like any other, and ended with Wren's hands shaking so hard she had to sit on the edge of the bathtub for 10 minutes before she trusted herself to walk back downstairs. She had wheeled Bianca out onto the terrace that afternoon, chasing a rare stretch of sun in an otherwise gray week, and left her there with a blanket over her knees while she went back inside for a cup of the ginger tea Bianca seemed to tolerate better than the others. When Wren came back out 2 minutes later, the wheelchair's brake had somehow slipped. Later, she'd learned one of the groundskeepers had left a hose coiled too close to the terrace's edge, and the chair's front wheel had caught it wrong, and Bianca was tipping, slow and terrible, toward the low stone balustrade and the 10-foot drop to the garden beds below. Wren didn't remember crossing the terrace. She remembered her hands closing around the wheelchair's handles a half-second before the front wheel would have gone over the edge, remembered the jolt of weight hitting her arms, remembered planting her feet and hauling backward with everything she had, tea forgotten and shattered somewhere behind her. The chair rocked, tipped further for one sickening second, and then came back down flat on all 4 wheels with a hard, jarring thud that rattled up through Wren's own spine. For a moment, neither of them moved. Wren's heart was slamming so hard she could feel it in her throat. She dropped to her knees in front of the wheelchair, hands going instantly, automatically, to Bianca's face, her pulse, checking her pupils, running through the exact triage sequence they'd drilled into her in clinicals, even though her voice came out cracked and much less clinical than she wanted it to. "Are you hurt? Bianca, look at me. Are you hurt anywhere? Does anything?" Bianca Vitali's right hand, the good one, shot out and gripped Wren's wrist. Her fingers were thin, but her grip was fierce, startlingly strong, and for the first time in 3 weeks her dark eyes weren't flat. They were wide and wet and locked onto Wren's face like she was trying to memorize it. She didn't say anything, but she didn't let go of Wren's wrist for a long time either, and when she finally did, her hand came up and rested, briefly, against the side of Wren's face. The way, Wren would think later, a mother checks a child for fever. Then Bianca withdrew her hand back into her lap, folded it over the other one, and looked back out at the garden, as if nothing had happened at all. Wren didn't tell Luca about the near fall until dinner that night, catching him in the hallway outside his study, still shaking a little as she explained what had happened, watching his face go through a rapid, controlled sequence. Alarm, then something colder and more dangerous, then a flat calm that she suspected was worse than either. "Show me," he said. She led him to the terrace. He knelt by the balustrade, examined the coil of hose still lying where it had caught the wheel, and his jaw worked once, hard, before he stood back up. "The groundskeeper responsible for the east terrace will be let go by morning," he said. "It was an accident," Wren said. "Nobody meant for that to happen." "My mother almost went over a stone railing because someone was careless with a garden hose," Luca said, his voice level and terrible in its evenness. "I don't deal much in accidents, Miss Delaney. I deal in consequences." He looked at her then, really looked, in a way that made her feel abruptly, uncomfortably visible. "You caught the chair." "It's my job." "Your job is to give her medication and help her stretch her hand," Luca said. "It is not your job to throw yourself in front of a falling wheelchair." Something moved behind his eyes, something he seemed to be working hard to keep off his face entirely. "Thank you," he said finally, like the words cost him something. "I mean that." "You're welcome," Wren said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it too. That night, for the first time, Bianca Vitali ate her entire dinner without needing to be coaxed through a single bite. The weeks that followed settled into something that felt, if not comfortable, at least survivable. Bianca still didn't speak, Not one syllable, not even the involuntary sound of pain when Dr. Okonkwo pushed her a little too hard in a session. But the silence between her and Ren had changed texture. It wasn't a wall anymore. It was closer to the kind of quiet that exists between two people who don't need to fill every second with noise. Ren kept up her running narration through their days regardless, telling Bianca about the ridiculous argument she'd overheard between two of the kitchen staff, or the shape of the clouds over the garden, or a memory from her own childhood that surfaced unbidden, her mother's hands, chapped from dish soap, braiding her hair too tight before school. Bianca listened. Ren could tell she was listening, by the way her dark eyes tracked Ren's face, by the way her right hand sometimes tapped, once, twice, against the arm of her wheelchair at something Ren said, like a private form of punctuation only she understood the rules of. One evening, about 5 weeks in, Luca stopped Ren in the kitchen while she was fixing Bianca's tea and told her, without much preamble, that a man named Costigan had sent word through a mutual associate that he wanted to discuss the redistribution of certain territories, language Ren didn't need translated to understand as a threat dressed up in a suit. "He's been circling for a year," Luca said, leaning against the counter, arms crossed, his tie already loosened from a long day. "Testing weak points, sending men to sit in restaurants I frequent, watching which roads my cars take at night. Nothing overt, nothing I could act on without starting something bigger than I want to start." His jaw tightened. "But he's getting bolder, and bold men eventually stop testing and start moving." "Should I be worried?" Ren asked, keeping her voice steady even as something cold settled low in her stomach. "I don't know yet," Luca admitted, which surprised her more than a reassurance would have. "I've increased the men on the gate. I've told the groundskeepers to report anything out of place, no matter how small. I'd rather overreact to nothing than underreact to something." He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his dark eyes. "I should have told you all of this before you agreed to live under this roof. It isn't fair, asking you to care for my mother without knowing what that might actually cost you." "You're telling me now," Ren said. "That counts for something." "Does it?" His voice had gone quieter, rougher at the edges. "My father used to say that the people who worked for this family were assets, and you protected assets because they were useful to you, not because you owed them the truth. I spent a long time believing that was just how things had to be run." He shook his head slightly, like he was arguing with a version of himself that used to live in that kitchen. "I don't want you to be an asset in this house, Ren. I want you to actually know what you're standing inside of." Ren set down the teapot and looked at him properly, this man who ran a criminal empire with a cold, practiced efficiency, and somehow still managed to look faintly lost standing in his own kitchen, trying to find the right words for a kind of honesty nobody had ever taught him to use. "Then keep telling me," she said. "I can handle knowing. What I can't handle is being kept in the dark and finding out the hard way." He hadn't known then, and neither had she, exactly how soon that particular fear would come true. Luca started appearing more often too. Not every night, but often enough that Ren began, without quite admitting it to herself, to listen for his footsteps the same way she'd learned to. He'd sit for a few minutes at the edge of his mother's sitting room some evenings, while Ren finished the last of the day's routine, watching the two of them with an expression she couldn't fully read, something caught between relief and an old, worn grief he didn't talk about. "She used to sing," he told Ren one night, out of nowhere, standing in the doorway with a glass of scotch he hadn't touched. "When I was young, in the kitchen, in the mornings while she made coffee. My father used to complain about it, and she never once stopped." He looked at his mother, asleep now in her chair, the last light gone from the window behind her. "I haven't heard her sing since he died." "What was he like?" Wren asked before she could stop herself, then immediately regretted the question, bracing for the shudders to come down over Luca's face, the way they had the one other time she'd tried to ask him something personal. But he only shrugged, a small, tired movement. He built this family into something that mattered. He also spent most of his life making sure the people who loved him were terrified of him at the same time. I used to think that was just how it had to be done. He glanced at Wren, and something in his expression shifted, opened a fraction. I'm starting to think he was wrong about that. Wren didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and Luca didn't seem to need her to. He stood in the doorway a while longer, watching his mother sleep, before he said goodnight and disappeared down the hall, and Wren stood there a moment longer than necessary before she went to check that Bianca's blanket was tucked in tight against the cold. It was almost 2 months into the job, on a Thursday that had started with nothing unusual at all, when the quiet of the estate broke apart. Wren had settled Bianca in the sitting room after lunch, the older woman dozing lightly in a patch of afternoon sun, while Wren sat nearby folding laundry from the hall closet, half listening to the murmur of the house around her, the distant clatter of the kitchen, Renata's fast footsteps somewhere on the stairs. It was the kind of ordinary afternoon that made Wren, sometimes, briefly forget exactly whose house she was living in. The first sign that something was wrong was the sound of a car engine cutting off too fast in the drive below, tires biting gravel hard enough to spray it against the fountain's stone base. Then voices, raised, urgent, coming from somewhere near the front of the house. Not the low, controlled murmur of Luca's usual business, but something sharper, more panicked. Wren was on her feet before she'd fully processed why, crossing to the sitting room's window in time to see 3 unfamiliar men crossing the front lawn at a dead run, coming not from the main drive, but from a gap in the tree line at the property's edge, where the wall dipped low enough near an old drainage culvert to be climbed. One of the estate's own security guards was sprinting toward them from the garage, shouting something Wren couldn't make out through the glass, and a second guard was fumbling to unholster a radio rather than a weapon, his hands clumsy with adrenaline. "Bianca," Wren said, low and urgent, already moving. "We need to go inside, right now." Bianca's eyes had snapped open the moment the shouting started, and whatever fog of sleep had been on her was gone instantly, replaced by a hard, focused alertness that made her look, for just a second, 20 years younger. She didn't argue. She didn't need to be told twice. Wren released the wheelchair's brake and pushed, fast, back through the sitting room's interior doors, away from the wide glass windows that made them both an easy thing to see from outside. Down the hall, she heard the front door burst open, not through force, she realized later, but because one of the men had simply thrown himself against the ornamental panel beside the main entrance, the weak point every old estate had if you knew where to look, and the shouting inside the house got immediately, dangerously louder. She heard Luca's voice, sharp and commanding, cutting through the chaos, and the heavier sound of at least one struggle, furniture scraping hard against marble, a lamp shattering somewhere. Wren pulled Bianca's wheelchair into the small reading room off the east hallway, the one with the heavy oak door and no windows facing the front lawn, and threw the bolt. Her hands were shaking again, the same way they had on the terrace, but her training kicked in underneath the fear, the way it always did. Assess, protect, stay calm. Don't let the patients see how scared you are. "We're going to be okay," she said, kneeling in front of Bianca's chair, keeping her voice low and even as her pulse hammered in her ears. "The door's solid. It's just us in here. We're going to be okay." Bianca's right hand found hers and gripped it, hard, and for a moment the two of them just sat there in the dark little room, listening to the muffled chaos on the other side of the wall, a shout, the heavy thud of a body hitting something solid, glass breaking, and then, abruptly, the flatter, sharper crack of a single gunshot that made Wren's whole body go rigid with terror. The sound didn't repeat. A few long, agonizing seconds later, she heard Luca's voice again, closer now, calling her name. "Ren! Ren, it's clear! Open the door!" She hesitated only a second before she recognized the exact cadence of his voice, the particular way he said her name, and unbolted the door. Luca stood in the hallway, his suit jacket torn at one shoulder, a shallow cut above his eyebrow beating slow lines of blood down toward his cheek, but on his feet, breathing hard, very clearly and entirely unbroken. Behind him, two of his security men were hauling a groaning, disoriented intruder up off the marble floor, his wrists already zip-tied, a nasty bruise blooming fast along his jaw where somebody's fist had connected. Through the far doorway, Ren could see a second man being marched out at gunpoint by the guard who'd been sprinting across the lawn, his shirt torn, and one arm held awkwardly against his ribs like it had taken a hard hit. There was no third man in sight. Later, she'd learn he'd bolted back over the wall the second the first shot rang out, more warning than injury, fired into the ceiling to end the scuffle before it turned into something worse. "Is she hurt?" Luca asked, already moving past Ren into the reading room, dropping to a crouch in front of his mother's chair, his hands hovering over her shoulders like he was afraid to touch her too hard and afraid not to touch her at all. "She's fine," Ren said. "Scared, but fine. I got her out the second I saw them coming." Luca's dark eyes lifted to Ren's face, and something in them cracked open entirely, all the careful control gone for just a moment. "You got her out," he repeated quietly, "before anyone told you to, before you even knew what was happening." "I didn't have time to wait for instructions." He looked at her for a long beat, something raw and unguarded moving across his face, and then he nodded once, sharp, like he was filing the moment away somewhere he wouldn't let himself examine too closely right now. "The rest of the house is secure," he said, standing. "Costigan's men, most likely. They've been probing my territory for weeks, testing how far they could push before I pushed back. They picked the wrong afternoon to find out." His jaw tightened. "Nobody in this house is seriously hurt. A few bruises, a split lip, my head cut where I hit the edge of the hall table. That's the worst of it. I want a doctor here within the hour anyway, just to be certain." "I can do a basic assessment now if it helps," Ren offered, "while you wait." Luca studied her for a moment, a woman kneeling in a dim reading room with his terrified, silent mother's hand still locked around her wrist, offering, without hesitation, to patch up the men who'd just fought off an attack on his house, and something in his expression softened in a way Ren hadn't seen from him before. "Take care of her first," he said quietly, nodding at Bianca. "Then I'll take you to the others." Ren spent the next hour moving between the injured. The intruder who'd taken the worst of it, a bruised jaw, a split knuckle on the hand he'd used to throw his own punch, got a quick, clinical once-over before he was hauled off by two of Luca's men, and Ren didn't ask what happened to him after that, some part of her deciding, with a clarity that surprised her, that it wasn't information she needed. Luca's own head wound turned out to be shallow, more dramatic-looking than dangerous, and Ren cleaned it and pressed a butterfly closure over it at the kitchen island, while he sat still and let her, watching her face the entire time instead of what her hands were doing. The security guard with the bruised ribs got wrapped and told, firmly, that he needed an actual X-ray in the morning whether he wanted one or not. By the time the house doctor finally arrived to confirm everything Ren had already assessed, the worst of the adrenaline had bled out of the estate, leaving behind the particular exhausted quiet that follows real fear. Ren found herself back in the sitting room near midnight, kneeling in front of Bianca's wheelchair to check her blood pressure one last time before bed, her hands finally steady again, the light blue of her scrub top smudged with someone else's blood at the cuff. Bianca watched her work in silence, the way she always did, but her right hand, when Ren finished and started to stand, caught the sleeve of her scrub top and held on. Ren looked down, startled, and found the old woman's dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made the back of her neck prickle. Bianca's mouth worked once, twice, like a muscle remembering a motion it hadn't performed in a very long time. Ren went very still, not daring to move, not daring to hope, watching 3 months of silence strain visibly against whatever was holding it in place. The word that finally came out wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was low and rough and cracked down the middle from disuse, spoken in the old tongue Bianca had grown up with and had apparently decided, 4 years ago, in a grief too large for English to carry, she would no longer use at all. It was one word. Ren didn't know the language well enough to be certain of its exact shape, but she understood its weight the second it left Bianca's mouth, the way you understand the meaning of a sound before you understand its spelling. A word mothers keep for the people they've claimed as their own, worn soft at the edges from decades of use before the silence swallowed it whole. Behind them, in the doorway, Renata made a small, strangled sound and pressed her hand over her mouth. Ren hadn't heard her come in. When she turned, Renata's eyes were wet, and down the hall, 2 of the security men who'd been standing post outside the room had gone completely, utterly still, the way soldiers go still at the sound of a bell they'd been told meant something important, even if they'd never expected to hear it rung. "She hasn't said that," Renata whispered, "since her husband's funeral." Ren turned back to Bianca. The old woman's dark eyes were wet, too, but there was nothing broken in them. There was something closer to relief, the particular relief of a person who has been holding an enormous weight for a very long time, and has finally set part of it down. "I heard you," Ren said softly, and closed her hand over Bianca's. "I'm right here." Bianca didn't say anything else that night. She didn't need to. She let Ren finish the blood pressure check, let herself be wheeled to her room, and settled into bed with the particular unhurried trust of someone who has decided, fully and finally, that this is a person she does not need to guard herself against anymore. When Ren dimmed the lights and turned to leave, Bianca's right hand lifted, briefly, in something that might have been a wave, or might have been a blessing, or might have simply been an old woman too tired to explain what she meant, and trusting, for the first time in months, that she didn't have to. Luca was waiting in the hallway when Ren came out, leaning against the wall with his jacket gone and his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, the small bandage over his eyebrow stark white against his skin. He'd clearly been standing there long enough to have heard everything. "Renata told me what she said," he said quietly when Ren approached. "What it means." "What does it mean?" Ren asked. "I didn't recognize the language well enough to be sure." Luca was quiet for a moment, looking down the hallway toward his mother's closed door, something working behind his eyes that Ren suspected he didn't often let anyone see. "It's what she used to call me," he said finally, "before my father died, and she stopped calling anyone anything at all. It's a word my grandmother used for my mother, and her mother used for her. It doesn't translate cleanly into English. The closest anyone's ever gotten is something like mine, but not in the way you own an object, in the way you claim a person, in the way you tell the world, without needing any more words than that one, that someone belongs to your family, whether blood put them there or not." Ren felt something catch hard in her chest, a lump she had to swallow past before she trusted her voice. "She barely knows me," she said. "It's only been 2 months." "She's known you exactly as long as it took her to decide you weren't going to leave," Luca said. "For a woman who buried her husband and watched 4 nurses walk out on her in 3 months, that's not nothing. That's practically a lifetime." He pushed off the wall, closing some of the distance between them, close enough that Ren could see the exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes, the particular rawness of a man who had almost lost the last member of his family that afternoon, and hadn't yet let himself fully feel it. You put yourself between my mother and a falling wheelchair without thinking twice. You got her behind a locked door before anyone told you the house was under attack. You patched up my head and a stranger's split knuckles in the same hour without asking a single question about who deserved it more. His voice dropped, rougher now, less careful. I've had men who've worked for my family for 15 years who wouldn't have moved as fast as you did today. I was scared out of my mind, Ren admitted. The whole time. My hands didn't stop shaking until an hour after it was over. Being scared and freezing are two different things, Luca said. Most people, when they're that afraid, they freeze. You didn't freeze once. He reached out, slowly, the way a man reaches towards something he isn't sure will let him get close, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face where it had come loose from its clip sometime during the chaos of the afternoon. His fingers were warm and careful, and lingered half a second longer than the gesture strictly required. I don't know what to do with a person who doesn't run from any of this, he said quietly. Everyone who's ever been close to my family has eventually run. My mother's nurses, my father's oldest friends once things got hard enough. Even my mother in her own way. She ran into silence instead of out the door, but she ran all the same. I'm not going anywhere, Ren said, and was a little surprised, saying it, by how completely true it felt. Luca looked at her for a long moment, something unguarded and almost disbelieving in his expression, like he was waiting for the words to reveal themselves as a lie the way every other reassurance in his adult life eventually had. When they didn't, something in his shoulders finally, visibly loosened. The men who came today, he said, changing direction, though Ren suspected it cost him something to step back from the moment they'd just had. They work for a man named Costigan. He runs the territory 2 districts over, and he's spent the last year deciding my family's holdings would look better under his name than mine. Today wasn't the first attempt. It's the first one that made it past the front gate. Is it going to happen again? I intend to make certain it doesn't, Luca said, and something in the flat, absolute certainty of his voice reminded Ren, briefly and uncomfortably, exactly what kind of man she'd been living under the roof of for 2 months. But I want you to understand what that means for you and for her. This house isn't safe the way it looked safe 2 months ago. If you want to leave, tonight, tomorrow, whenever the shock of today catches up with you, no one in this house will stop you or think less of you for it. You didn't sign up to have your patient nearly kidnapped. Ren thought about her landlord's 5-day notice, taped to her apartment door what felt like a lifetime ago. She thought about the flat, assessing stare Bianca Vitali had given her on her first day, and the word she'd spoken tonight, rough and cracked and entirely genuine. She thought about Luca's hand brushing her hair back from her face, careful in a way nothing else about his life seemed to be. I'm staying, she said. The days that followed the attack were tense in a way the previous 2 months hadn't been. Luca doubled the security detail around the estate's perimeter and had the low dip in the property wall near the drainage culvert reinforced within 48 hours. A crew of men working through a cold, driving rain to make sure no one used that gap again. He was gone more often, meetings that ran late into the night, and when he was home he carried a coiled, watchful tension in his shoulders that Ren recognized, from her clinical rotations, as the particular exhaustion of someone running on adrenaline and too little sleep. But something had shifted, underneath the tension, that Ren could feel even when she couldn't name it. Bianca spoke now. Not often, not fluently, her words still coming slow and effortful, rebuilding a muscle that had gone unused for 4 years. But she spoke, in halting English mixed with the older, rougher language Ren was slowly learning to recognize the shape of, if not the exact meaning. She told Ren, over the course of several afternoons, about the small apartment she'd shared with her husband when they'd first come to this country with nothing. She told her about Luca as a boy, stubborn and quick-tempered and fiercely protective of anyone smaller than him on the playground. A boy who used to bring home injured birds and cry when they didn't survive the night despite his best efforts to nurse them back to health. "He still does that," Bianca said one afternoon, her right hand resting lightly on Ren's where it rested on the arm of the wheelchair. "Brings home broken things, tries to fix them." Her dark eyes, sharp again in a way they hadn't been in months, moved to Ren's face with unmistakable meaning. "You are not broken, but he still looked at you like a bird with a hurt wing that first day. I watched him do it." "I don't think he sees me that way anymore," Ren said, feeling her face go warm. "No," Bianca agreed, a ghost of something that might one day become a full smile touching the corner of her mouth. "Now he looks at you like a man looks at the roof he finally trusts not to fall in on him while he sleeps." She patted Ren's hand once, decisively. The conversation closed. "That is better. Do not let him talk himself out of it. He is very good at talking himself out of things that are good for him. His father did the same." 3 weeks after the attack, on a night when the last of the reinforcement crew had finally finished the wall and the house had begun, cautiously, to exhale, Ren found Luca on the terrace where Bianca's wheelchair had very nearly gone over the balustrade months before. He was standing at the railing with a glass in his hand that he still, as far as she'd ever seen, mostly didn't drink from, looking out over the dark garden. "She talks now," he said, without turning around, having clearly heard her footsteps on the stone. "Every day, a little more. I keep waiting to wake up and find out I dreamed it." "She told me today that you used to cry over dead birds," Ren said, coming to stand beside him at the railing. A short, surprised laugh escaped him, unguarded, the first she'd ever heard from him. "God, I haven't thought about that in 20 years. He looked over at her, the moonlight catching the sharp planes of his face, softening none of the danger in it, and somehow, at the same time, making it easier to look at directly than it had been the first day she'd met him in the marble foyer. "I used to think being like my father meant I couldn't afford to feel things like that anymore. Turns out I just got very good at hiding it. You're the first person who's made me forget to." "I didn't do anything," Ren said. "I just didn't leave." "That's not nothing," Luca said, echoing, without seeming to realize it, the exact words he'd used about his mother weeks before. He set the glass down on the railing and turned to face her fully, close enough now that she could feel the warmth coming off him against the cold night air. "I told you, the night of the attack, that I didn't know what to do with a person who doesn't run from any of this. I've had 3 weeks to think about it, and I still don't have a good answer. I only know that I don't want you to." "Then don't let me," Ren said quietly. He kissed her the way a man kisses something he's spent months convincing himself he isn't allowed to want. Careful at first, like he expected her to pull away, and then not careful at all once he understood she wasn't going to. When he finally drew back, his hand still cupped along her jaw, his dark eyes were open in a way she hadn't seen from him even once in the 2 months she'd known him, all the careful control set down somewhere he clearly had no intention of picking it back up from. "My mother is going to be unbearable about this," he murmured, a real smile finally breaking across his face, transforming it entirely. "She's going to claim she saw it coming from the very first day." "She might have," Ren said, thinking of the flat, assessing stare from her first afternoon in that gold and cream sitting room. A stare she understood now had never been dismissal at all. It had been a woman deciding, in total silence, exactly how long it would take this particular stranger to prove herself worth the risk of speaking to again. The following month brought a strange, hard-won normalcy to the estate. Dr. Okonkwo, arriving for Bianca's Friday session, nearly dropped his clipboard the first time she greeted him by name. Not with the flat stare he'd grown resigned to, but with an actual, if halting, "Good morning," her accent thick and her words careful, like she was placing each one down gently to make sure it wouldn't break. He told Luca afterward, in the hallway where Ren happened to be passing, that in 15 years of practice he had never seen a stroke patient's speech return the way Bianca's had. Not through medication, not through any therapy technique in his training, but through what he could only describe, a little sheepishly, as sheer stubborn love refusing to let a person stay silent. Renata took to humming while she worked again, something Ren hadn't realized had gone missing from the house until it came back. The kitchen staff stopped flinching every time Bianca's wheelchair rolled past the doorway. Even the security men on the gate, the ones who Renata swore had once been more afraid of Bianca's silence than of any rival family, started greeting her with small, genuine nods when she was wheeled out for her afternoon air, the kind of respect that had nothing to do with fear at all. Ren found herself, in quiet moments, hardly recognizing the version of her own life she was living now. 2 months ago, she'd been counting change for gas money and dodging calls from her landlord. Now she woke up in a house with more rooms than she could name, cared for a woman who had started, in the last few weeks, calling her nothing else but the one soft word she'd first spoken on that terrible, unforgettable night, and found herself, more often than she wanted to admit even to herself, listening for the sound of a certain set of footsteps on the marble downstairs. She and Luca didn't rush anything in the weeks after that first kiss on the terrace. There wasn't room, in a house recovering from an attack, for anything to move faster than trust allowed. But he started finding reasons to be home earlier, a meeting cut short, a dinner he chose not to schedule, and some evenings, after Bianca was settled for the night, the two of them sat together in the quiet of the study, not talking about business, not talking about Costigan or the reinforced wall or the men still stationed at the gate, just talking about nothing at all, the way people do when they've finally found someone they don't have to perform for. "My mother asked me yesterday," Luca told her one such evening, swirling a glass of scotch he still mostly didn't drink, "when I was going to stop being an idiot and marry you." Ren nearly choked on her tea. "She did not." "She did," Luca said, the corner of his mouth pulling up in the smile that had become, over the last several weeks, entirely too easy to memorize. "In 3 different languages, apparently, in case I missed her meaning in the first 2. He set the glass down and reached for her hand across the small space between their chairs, his thumb tracing slow, absent circles against her knuckles. "I told her I wasn't going to rush you, that you'd been through enough without me adding pressure to it." "And what did she say to that?" "She said," Luca said, "that I inherited my father's patience for business and none of his patience for anything that actually mattered, and that if I waited too long, some smarter man would notice what I had before I got around to saying so out loud." He looked at Ren then, something steady and certain settling into his expression. None of the careful control he'd worn like armor the day they'd met. "For what it's worth, I think she might be right. I'm not in any hurry, but I want you to know I'm not confused about what I want either." "Good," Ren said, feeling something warm unspool in her chest that had nothing to do with fear at all, for the first time since she'd walked through those iron gates. "Because neither am I." 6 weeks later, on a bright, cold Sunday afternoon, Ren wheeled Bianca out onto the terrace to watch the last of the winter light fall gold across the garden, the reinforced stretch of wall beyond it standing solid and unbroken against the tree line. Luca joined them, dropping into the chair beside his mother's, and for a long while none of them said anything at all. The comfortable kind of silence now, the kind that didn't need filling, the kind that existed because everyone in that little circle had finally, fully decided they belonged in it. "You are staying," Bianca said eventually, not quite a question, her English steadier now with every week of practice, her hand finding Ren's the way it had that first terrifying night. Both of you, together, in this house. If that's all right with you, Ren said. Bianca Vitale looked at her for a long moment, the same flat, assessing look she'd given her on the very first day. And then, for the second time since Ren had known her, she smiled. Small and a little crooked from the stroke's lingering hold on the left side of her face, but entirely, unmistakably real. She said the one word again, softer this time. Certain. No one in that house had dared speak to Bianca Vitale for 3 long months. But it turned out all it ever took was one nurse who refused to be afraid of her silence, and one word, old and worn soft with love, to bring the whole house back to life around her. What do you think finally made Bianca decide to speak again? Was it the near fall on the terrace, the night of the attack, or simply a young woman who refused to stop talking to her, even when she got nothing back? Let us know your theory in the comments below. If this quiet, slow burn story about family, loyalty, and finding your voice again pulled you in, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe for more heartfelt mafia romance stories every week. See you in the next one.